Welcome back to Cards and Comics. Today I want to answer one of the questions I've had since I've really started collecting vintage cards, which is how much rarer are high-grade 1950s Hall of Fame cards versus 1960s? And to answer that question, I went deep into the pop counts and the checklist and created my own data set and my own analysis, so we'll get right into it. First up, I had to define what high-grade Hall of Famer meant. So I defined it as the grades of PSA 7, 8, and 9. I used PSA exclusively because it has the higher pop counts. It also would have been harder to combine SGC and PSA data into one report. Also, half grades and PSA 10s are rarely given out for these years, so they would not have contributed much in terms of the data analysis, and it also would have just taken a lot more time. I used PSA's Hall of Fame registry set checklist by year. For reference, I did only look at Topps and Bowman cards. I excluded things like 54 Red Heart and 63 Flair just because I wanted to focus only on the two biggest sets or manufacturers that were out there that were mostly distributed nationally and had the biggest volume of pop counts. Now, 63 Flair could have counted, and I may do another set of analysis to include it, but right now I just focus on Topps and Bowman cards. I removed all All-Star League Leader, multiple player cards, etc. from the data set and really just wanted to focus on the player's actual cards, not cards with other players on it or just let's say subset cards. I just wanted the base cards. Now, I did keep a lot of coach cards and umpire cards in the set because in a lot of cases, the only cards available of these Hall of Famers are these cards, such as the 55 Bowman umpire cards, or sometimes coach cards, just that's the only cards they have. So I kept them in the data set for the most part. For cards with multiple variations, such as white and gray backs in 56, red and black backs in 52 Topps, I just added the numbers together and created one data point so I could do the analysis. Let me know what you think about the criteria. I know some people will object, some people will critique. I welcome anyone to create their own criteria and do their own analysis because I would love to see the differences between my approach and someone else's. So here's an example of a data set I created. So again, this is all done by hand, and I did it in Excel. Took about 20 hours to get all the data together. So here's the 50 Bowman set, which has 27 Hall of Fame players in it. You can see I added up the amount of 7, 8, and 9s in the total column. Then I did an average there. You can see the 109. The 109 is basically the amount of high grade cards available per Hall of Fame player from the 50 Bowman set. So on average, every Hall of Fame player in the 50 Bowman set has about 109 cards available between the grades 7 and 9. The PSA 8 column, which I use PSA 8 because that's the grade that is very exclusive to a lot of set registry collectors and what people consider to be the highest grade available of most vintage cards, meaning that the PSA 9 and 10 are kind of unicorns in a lot of years, and the 8 is really the highest grade you can get that's available to buy. And so it's the grade that a lot of people use to judge, let's say, how nice their set is by seeing how many PSA 8s they have. That's sort of like the base high grade card. The 7 is definitely a high grade card for a lot of years, but the 8's definitely got a huge premium. So look at that grade quite a bit as well. You can see there on average there's 40 PSA 8s per card, Hall of Fame card in the 50 Bowman set. So that's sort of the two big numbers to look at. I did set a medium number here because I wanted to see if the data was skewed a little bit, a median versus average to see if the data sets were again, skewed. And that is just a really simple way to do it. And most data sets were pretty normally distributed, at the mean versus, skewed left to right. Percent is basically percentage of cards that grade in a certain number. You can see if I were to show you the entire data set, like the 50s and 60s, start to modify or go from left to right. meaning that the higher percentages start hitting the 8s and 9s the further you get into the decade, and that seems realistic based on just how many more availability of those cards are in those grades. So you can see a percentage goes higher in the 8 and 9 in general for sets over the time. But again, every set has its own unique fingerprint and distribution of grades. So you just can't say every set follows this pattern because again, 66 tops is a lot more difficult to get than 65 tops. So it's just every year kind of has its own unique pattern. So if we do one comparison to kind of level set how the data came out. So I take the rarest set from the 60s, compare it to the rarest set of the 50s, and just looking at the Hall of Fame players again, what do we get? Well, the 60 set of the rarest is 62 tops. No surprise for people who collect a lot of 60s Hall of Famers or do registry sets of players. The 62 tops is generally the hardest card to get. Any player from the 60s. So the average amount of high grade cards per player is 454, and the average amount of PS8 cards per player is 139. And this is definitely the toughest year in the 60s by far. So this is definitely the set that's hardest to find in the 60s. Compare that to the 1950 set that's the hardest to get, which is 50 Bowman, which we just talked about having 109 high-grade cards per player and 40 PSA8s per player. You can see there's some magnitudes differences in the amount of availability. If you just do the math, the high-grade volume per player is 4 times rarer for the 50 Bowman set, and the PSA8 is about 3.5 times rarer. So that just shows you the order of magnitude we're dealing with if you compare the hardest to get from the 50s to the 60s. And this multiplier definitely goes down if you just do it in totality because, again, the 1950 sets towards the end of the decade became a lot more similar in population count to 60 sets, and so that kind of averages out is lower, but it's still significant. So we'll look at it in totality next. So in totality, if you add all years together, the average amount of high-grade cards per player in the 50s is 377 versus 710 in 1960s, which is a multiplier, which is the most relevant number to look at here, of 1.9. So basically, they're twice as rare on average. So it's any card from the 50s versus any card from the 60s, on average, is about 2 times harder to find. If you just look at the PSA8, it's a 2.3 times harder to get. And then PSA 9s in the 50s are just much more rare, and they're over 4 times harder to find than a 60s PSA 9 for a Hall of Famer. So it just shows you why the 50s Hall of Famers, if you can find a 9, they're worth tremendously more in terms of just the delta than a lot of 60s Hall of Famers and 9s because they're just so much harder to find. And I thought this was interesting that 2x multiplier seems about right from just when I look at the smell test of data. Does it look right? Does it seem like this is the real number? And it came out. I thought, okay, well that seems legitimate. My own experience, but there's definitely year-to-year variation, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So if you rank all the sets 1 to 24, that's how many sets there were to look at. You can see how they all rank together, meaning the 50 Bowman set overall is the hardest to get. 68 tops is the easiest to get, right? And if you look at both in total high grade card availability or PSA 8 availability, the rank is kind of similar, but you see some differences. For example, 51 Bowman goes from number 3 overall to number 5 overall if you just go from PSA or from high grade availability to just PSA 8, showing that there's a lot of 7s available in 51 Bowman that give it less PSA 7s available, but a lot of 51 Bowman 8s are available, so that makes that ranking change. Now, if you look at the arrows here, that is what I call the average amount for 1960s. So the average amount of high grade cards available and the average amount of PSA 8s available is that arrow right there. You can see Only 150 set is below that arrow, that line for high grade availability, the 59 set, and no sets are below it in the PSA 8 availability. It just shows you that basically on average, every 50 set, 1950 set, is rarer in terms of average available PSA 8s than every 60 set. So there is no than the average for a 60 set. So it just shows you that on average, all 50 sets are more rare for PSA 8s than the 60s as a whole group. And that just shows you that, even the 59 set is rare comparatively to most 60 sets. And I think that is something to think about is even the most available 50 set is still rarer than basically half of the 60s. And if you get into other anomalies, you'll just see that early 50s is just incredibly rare compared to late 50s and most 60 sets. So if you look at it in aggregate, you'll see some really interesting things too. If you look at it, this visual representation, this chart here of everything kind of laid out, and just looking at PSA 8s, the thing I look at here is that you see some, that whole kind of ramping up, and if you had a trend line here, it would, definitely be trending up the entire time. However, you see some things that make me, just interesting. Like for example, the 55 Bowman set on average is just much lower than the 54 or 55 tops. So you can see it's just the anomaly. In fact, it's the lowest amount of PSA availability. You have to go back to 52 tops to find a set that was harder to find. And in fact, it's basically the third rarest set overall in terms of PSA availability of the 50s and 60s combined. And I don't think a lot of us think of that set as that rare, but I think it's also because it may be just because people don't like it as much from a popularity perspective. So I'll talk about that in a little bit, but why the cards probably aren't worth as much as they should be based on just rarity. Now, the big jump in the 50s comes from between 1955 tops and 1956 tops. Basically, the average PSA pop count went up 100 cards, basically, between 55 and 56. So that's a huge jump because in a lot of years, there wasn't even 100 cards available between any set from 1950 to 1954. So just from 55 to 56 alone, it went up on average over 100, almost 100 cards per player. And so that's when the pop counts between for 50 sets became very similar to 60 sets, because you see 56, 57, 59, 60, 63, 64 are all between 245 and 260, a delta of 20 cards. That's very similar in terms of just amount availability. And so that's when the 1950 sets really, I call it jumping the shark in terms of availability. Now you had the 58 set, which was much less available. I think that's well documented that in 58 there was condition issues with the paper quality, the printing quality, a lot of printer dots, a lot of just off-center issues. So 58 had some printing issues and condition issues that made availability go way down again. But back in 59, it went right back up when the quality of the cards became better. Now, the other anomaly you see here is 62 tops, and we talked about it, that basically it's the biggest anomaly of the entire decade is that the set is so hard to find on PSA 8. And I think that is, and everyone who collects 60s cards just knows that. But the other anomaly to me is, between 64 and 65, you had that another 100 card jump in a pop availability. So in 64, there was 262, and 65 is 360. And then you had that another swoon, just like in 58. This is 66 tops, where it goes back down to 237, which is right in line with the early 60s and late 50 sets. So why did the pop availability go so far down in 66? And if you look at 67, it goes right back up to 360, and then it goes even higher from there. On average. So why did 66 tops go so far down? And I don't really have a story on 66 to share or some assumptions because it's to me more of a mystery. I think, from just collecting the set and talking to collectors, there are centering issues And maybe also that, in 66 there was some other things going on, maybe a plant issue or a factory issue that caused, some availability to go down. Maybe they didn't print as many that year. I don't know, but man, it was definitely noticeable in the pop count that there's just not as many available. The other stat that is an anomaly that we haven't talked about too much is because it's the anomaly on the high side is 61 tops. And why is that set so much easier to find and get? I think the printing quality of that set was very good. It's a very simple design that's easy to determine what a good card and what a bad card is. But I also think the 60 World Series between the Pirates and the Yankees was very popular and ended on a tremendous Game 7. And I think that may have spurred some extra sales or some availability of the cards because there was maybe just more printing happening in 61 due to the popularity of the 60 World Series and that year and that season. I don't know. That's just something I'm thinking about as a Pirate fan. Maybe that's what happened. But I don't have any real data to prove it. It's just one of the hypotheses I have. So this is the data set that I think is most impactful when you just look at, if I'm buying cards from the 50s and 60s, how do I stack the years up and which years are more rare than others? I think this is a great visual representation of that. Next up, I want to talk about low pop. So this idea that there's cards in every set that are just harder to get than other cards from the same set. And I've defined low pops as any PSA 8 below 100 and any PSA 9 below 10. So if you look at the 60s, really only 2 years have a lot of low pops at 62 and 63. And we know 62 and 63 are harder to get from a condition perspective, because colored borders and 62 tops just in general have always had, printing issues that cause things to be lower. Now, if you look at, in general, outside of those 2 years, from 64 to 69, there's only 4 cards below 100. And in terms of PSA 8s, only 9. So really, 63 tops is the last year where you have these kind of ultra low pops in the 60s. So that's a pretty big, year gap between the other sets in terms of just, low pop availability. Now, if you go to the 50s, there's a lot of sets that had, low pop availability. In fact, all the way up into 55 Bowman. Most years, in fact, 50 Bowman and 51 Bowman, virtually every card is a low pop. And same way for 55 Bowman, virtually every card in the set's a low pop, both in 8s and 9s. But when you get to 55 tops, you see that availability of card in terms of high grade goes much higher. And then at 56, we saw that 100 card jump, right? That virtually makes no cards a low pop anymore on the PSA 8 side, and very few PSA 9s. But again, 58 shows up again, and you see a little more low pop availability. But you can see, 55 tops was really the start of the condition availability. And 56 is what it kind of like became just like 60 sets. So you can definitely see that delineation in the low pop count here as well. Now, going into the actual cards that are low pops from the 50s and 60s. So in the 50s, I just said, virtually every Hall of Fame card from 1950 through 54 is a low pop, except for 54 tops, which you have really Ted Williams, Monty Irvin. Both Ted Williams cards, by the way, Larry Delby, Gil Hodges. So, I think that's important to know. The Ted Williams cards are the first and last card in the set. So you get things like, rubber band damage. You get just damage from being stacked in the box first or last. And then Monty Irvin, Larry Delby are kind of like, I hate to say newer Hall of Famers, but they haven't been graded quite as often. So that might be why they're just not as available. Now, in 55 Bowman, there's only 4 cards in the whole Hall of Fame set that's not a low pop. And that's Phil Rizzuto, Campanella, Al Kaline, and Whitey Ford. So virtually every other Hall of Famer in that set is a low pop. So it just shows you how much tougher the 55 Bowman set is in general. Now, in 55 tops, the 2 cards that really stick out to me is, Warren Spahn. I did not realize Warren Spahn was a low pop, based on my criteria. And, that the fact that the Yogi Berra is still a low pop after all these years. So it's, he was a low pop early on. and he stayed that way. So I think, Yogi and Spawn being low pops is interesting to me. In 57 tops, you really only have Larry Doby, and then 58, you have a lot more players. But I didn't realize that Don Drysdale and the Eddie Matthews were still low pops comparatively. So, because I see cards like these sell sometimes, and I don't realize, hey, these are low pops. Like the Drysdale and the Matthews, are cards that are harder to find. Now, the Mazeroski I have because I'm a Pirate collector, and I know how hard that card is to find in a PSA 8 or above. So I was aware that it was hard to get, but it's still a low pop to this day. So it's very interesting, though, that Drysdale and Matthews are low pops. Now, in the 60s, obviously, we talked about only 62 and 63 have a large amount of low pops. But the Jim Bunning and 60 tops was interesting to me that it's a low pop. The early win, I think it's the first card in the set. So that explains that a little bit. But in 62 tops, you basically have tons of Hall of Famer, and I call it tier one Hall of Famers like Willie Mays. You have Warren Spahn, you have Bob Gibson. Now, those are major Hall of Famers. Frank Robinson, these guys are big names at B low pops, and it's very well known about Frank Robinson and Willie Mays, but I didn't know that Cepeda and Shandy's and Robin Roberts and Mazeroski and those guys were still low pops. Billy Williams, these guys are still Hall of Famers, and they still have very few PSA 8s and 9s available. And so, those cards are worth quite a bit of money when they come up for sale. 63 tops, the biggest card for me was the Yogi Berra. I didn't realize the 63 Yogi was still that top. I knew it was pretty tough because it sells so well, but I did not realize it was such a low pop. And then the rest of the cards are basically manager cards. And again, a lot of times the manager cards are just not submitted very often, and they keep the pop counts low. I think those cards would eventually, if they become worth more, for example, if they go up in value, you'll see more of those cards be graded. Now, the last thing I want to talk about here is the zero pop PSA 9s. So are there still Hall of Famers with zero pops? Well, the two that really stood out to me, or the one card that really stood out to me, again, the 52 top is Billy Herman. Okay, it's a 52 top, so it's worth quite a bit of money if it ever comes up. But it's really the 55 Bowman Eddie Matthews. There's been no PSA 9s. It's very interesting to me that there's not been a 55 Bowman Eddie Matthews that's graded a 9. Considering how many set registry collectors there are, Hall of Fame registry collectors there are, Eddie Matthews collectors there are, Braves collectors there are, that one of these cards hasn't been submitted that came up a 9. And 55 Bowmans have a history of some shenanigans. GAI, there was some re-glossed cards that got graded, some cards with back creases that got graded. So the set itself has had some issues, but man, that Matthews is a card that would be, I can't imagine what a 9 would bring right now in this current market. So it's very interesting to me that that card still is out there without a 9. Now, again, we talked about the two sets that I think are highly underrated. 55 Bowman, we've talked about it quite a bit. So many cards in that set are low pops. It's just one of those sets that it's very interesting to me that it's not worth more, but I think it's not worth more because people either love or hate the design. So it's very polarizing. When I first started collecting in the hobby, and go to card shows, the vintage dealers would always tell me, don't spend a lot of money for 55 Bowmans, 54 Bowmans. No one likes those sets. They're kind of ugly. You're not going to get people to give you your money back for those cards. They're not going to go up in value compared to other sets because they're just not very popular. So it was very highly recommended not to spend a lot of money on those sets because people just didn't like them as much. I think that's still sort of how it is today. I think they're just polarizing, and either you love them or you hate them. But it's made it where the cards, even though they're really hard to find, aren't worth more. 66 tops is a different story. I think it's, like the Maze, for example, brings a lot of money, but I just don't think people realize how tough some of the Hall of Famers are. And in general, it's a mid-60s set. And honestly, people love the 65 set more from a design perspective. I think it overshadows the 66 set to some extent in terms of just design. So I feel like eventually maybe the 66 top set will get more popular as people look at pop counts, but it may or may not happen. So yeah, that is my review. Let me know what you guys think. about my analysis of 50s versus 60s cards. What's been your experience? Do you agree? Do you think there's other ways to look at the data? And I'm open for suggestion for any new videos if you guys want to see me look at some other numbers. And I'll see you next time on Cards and Comics. Bye.